Welcome back to those of you who may have joined us last week. And hello to November and us leading into ECHIA Awareness Week, November 17th through the 21st. Thank you so much for being here for another one of our Pennsylvania ECHIA Learning Series. My name is Taylor Teichman, if you're not already familiar, and I am the Youth Development Coordinator with our PA ECHIA program. And today you are joining us for supporting youth at the intersection of homelessness, foster care, and juvenile justice, leveraging federal education programs. I am very excited to get things started this morning by passing them off to my good colleague, Matthew Buczynski.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Taylor. Taylor is my colleague here at the Center for Schools and Communities, and it's always great to drop into an ECHIA Learning Series session and talk about intersections of these youth. So we want to welcome everyone and really just share that the purpose of today's session is to highlight why those of us supporting students experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, and students in juvenile justice placements should be working together. And this webinar has been several months in the making, and we're really excited to have NDTAC leading today's discussion on this topic. We'll be exploring today that there are really clear intersections among these student groups, and it's important that we understand the programs that support them and how we can better collaborate together. Many of us may be serving the same students, just at different points in time. So by identifying where our work overlaps, building strategies for transitions and referrals, and strengthening our communication, we can make a real difference in how these students are supported. And with that, I'm passing it over to NDTAC to get us started and oriented for today's session.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on supporting youth at the intersection of homelessness, foster care, and juvenile justice. I'm very excited to share information about how we can leverage federal programs to better serve with vulnerable students. Like Matt said, we often serve the same students across these programs, and we're hoping that today's webinar kind of helps ground and provide some more information on that. So I'm going to begin with a review of our agenda, and we're going to begin with introductions of our presenters. Then we will dive into the concept of multi-system involvement and the cross-cutting challenges that youth face. We'll spend some time exploring Pennsylvania's Act 1 of 2022, so 2022, that provides important protections for students experiencing educational instability. Then we'll take a detailed look at 3 federal programs, so Title I Part D, McKinney-Vento, and Title I Part A foster care provisions. We'll then discuss collaboration strategies at both the state and local level, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A and a discussion where we hope to learn a lot more about your experiences. And so we've designed this webinar to be interactive, so please be prepared to share your thoughts, your questions, your insights in the chat, or feel free to unmute and speak. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat just so that you don't forget them. And towards the end, we'll have a Q&A section. If for some reason we don't get to all of the questions, we will be happy to send out emails responding to people's questions. All right, so our webinar objectives. We have 3 key objectives that we would like to achieve by the end of this webinar. So first, we hope that you'll be able to describe the developing challenges faced by youth experiencing homelessness, youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. And so it's critical that we understand how these systems intersect and how they compound difficulties for young people. Second, we'll explore key resources and strategies for fostering collaboration across federal programs, because we know that no single program can address all of the needs of multi-system involved youth. And third, we want this to be a collaborative learning experience, as I said before. So we hope that you'll be able to share and engage in discussions, share some promising practices from your own work, and develop actionable strategies to improve educational outcomes for students who are neglected, delinquent, at-risk, homeless, or in foster care. All right, so I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce our great presenters. We have a great group of people presenting today. So first, my name is Obioma Okobwe. I am the co-director and the co-TA lead at NDTAC. NDTAC stands for the National Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth. I know it's a mouthful, so we usually just shorten it to NDTAC. And so as NDTAC, we serve as a national resource center to provide direct assistance to states, schools, communities, and parents who are seeking information on the education of youth and children and youth who are considered to be neglected, delinquent, or at risk. And during the webinar, I'm going to explain, what those terms mean, what we consider to be neglected, delinquent, or at risk for the purposes of Title I, Part D. The education of youth involved in the juvenile justice system is a primary focus of the center. And so joining me today from NDTAC is Christine Chan, who is our research lead at NDTAC, and you'll be hearing from her shortly. And then we also have Karen Rice, the Senior Manager of Education Initiatives at SchoolHouse Connection, which is an organization dedicated to supporting students experiencing homelessness. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the great work that SchoolHouse Connection does. And Karen has been so kind to join us today to talk a little bit about McKinney-Vento. And of course, we have Matt Butensky. You all know him. He's your Youth Development Project Manager at Center for Schools and Communities here in Pennsylvania. And together, three of us bring expertise, or rather, four of us bring expertise across all three federal programs that we'll be discussing today. And we're passionate about ensuring that vulnerable youth receive the support that they need to succeed academically. All right. So this webinar really draws heavily from a recent publication that NDTAC made titled Program Feature on the Intersection of Title I Part D, McKinney-Vento Act, and Title I Part A Foster Care. It was actually released in 2024 last year, and Matt saw the resource and asked us, extended an invitation for us to speak. Like he said, this has been months in the making. He wanted us to come and speak more about the intersection of these three federal programs and the students that they serve, especially considering that Pennsylvania has the Act 1 of 2022. So the brief provides some detailed guidance on how these three federal programs intersect and how practitioners can better leverage those programs to support youth who are involved in multiple systems, because as I'm sure a lot of us know, a lot of these students cut across each of these systems at different points in their life. So I encourage you to reference this document as a follow-up to this session. And it's available on our NDTAC website. I think Christine is going to pop the link in the chat, and it provides additional depth on many of the topics that we'll cover today. We're not going to cover everything in the brief, but I think this webinar is a good starting point to then, go and use the brief to extend further. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Christine, who will be talking about youth who are involved in multiple systems and the challenges that they face in their education journeys. Christine.
Thanks, Obioma. Now let's turn our attention to the research on multi-system involvement and the cross-cutting challenges that face students we serve. Understanding these challenges is fundamental in providing effective support and developing collaborative approaches across systems. So let me walk you through just a few slides to kind of lay the foundation for our discussion. So students connected to a single system, whether it's homelessness, foster care, or juvenile justice, are significantly more likely to experience involvement with other systems if early intervention prevention services are not provided. So for example, research shows that children and youth who experience homelessness are more likely to have been involved with the foster care system, the juvenile justice system, or both. And these connections aren't a coincidence. They reflect shared risk factors, including poverty, family instability, trauma, and lack of supportive services. So when we fail to intervene early with comprehensive supports, we often see youth cycling through multiple systems, each with its own challenges and requirements. And this reality really underscores why coordination across these systems is so essential to our conversations. Let's look at just some very specific educational challenges that are common across this population. First, chronic absenteeism is a major issue, especially post-pandemic. So this refers to really the frequent housing and placement changes that make consistent school attendance extremely difficult. Learning disruptions are also common due to the transition between schools and systems and placements, which create gaps in education. School mobility, meaning multiple school transfers, leads to a loss of academic progress and credits. So these students are identified for special education services at rates 2 to 3 times higher than their peers, and they experience disproportionately exclusionary discipline, so like suspension, expulsions at rates 3 or 4 times higher. Perhaps most concerning, I think these populations have significantly lower graduation rates compared to the general student population. And the educational challenges on this slide as a whole aren't really separate issues, right? You've seen these issues in the populations that you work with, and they're interconnected challenges that really require comprehensive, coordinated services and a coordinated response. And so here's really the crucial point that we want to really iterate throughout this presentation is that sometimes, or even oftentimes, we're talking about the same students facing all these challenges simultaneously. And when systems don't coordinate, we see predictable problems like the lack of coordination across systems means that students are falling through the cracks. So there's delays in school transfers of records, or records get lost entirely. Oftentimes there's an absence of maybe a transition coordinator that OBM was going to kind of address in Title I Part D for you, which could help students really navigate moves between placements or facilities. And then we might see complications in translating course credits across schools, but also across state lines if youth are kind of moving across geography. And there's this heightened risk of homelessness after youth leave residential or out of home placements, whether that's leaving foster care or leaving juvenile justice facilities without the adequate support and planning that they need. And all of these systemic failures really compound things that are also going on with the youth, which relates to trauma and instability. Now we're going to turn our focus to Pennsylvania and really the important work that's being done in this state to address educational instability. Matt will share information about Pennsylvania's Act 1 of 2022, which represents significant progress in supporting students who experience these challenges.
Thanks, Christine. And before we move on, I just wanted to say I put a comment in the chat for those of you that work with children and youth that experience multi-system involvement. You work with these different student populations to like that comment if you do. And just to see, one, are many of you working with the same students? Or two, another strategy of our outcome hope for the webinar today, which is that we collaborate better together. So I just wanted to put that in the chat to get some gauge of the audience that we have with us today. But thank you, Christine, for that introduction. And I know many of you are already familiar with Act 1, but we could not talk about the intersections of these student groups without reminding everyone about Act 1 of 2022, which is also known as Assisting Students Experiencing Education Instability. And when planning this webinar, I felt that it was really critical to make this connection with this newer Pennsylvania state law. So myself, along with several of my colleagues at the Center for Schools and Communities, and in partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Education, we are providing technical assistance and training and implementation oversight of Act 1. But we wanted to share a few more details with you today, just so we have a foundational understanding of it. Act 1 of 2022, I keep saying it, but it is a really groundbreaking piece of legislation that we have here in the state of Pennsylvania, designed to disrupt the negative education outcomes associated with education instability. And the law recognizes that certain student populations face unique barriers that traditional education policies don't adequately address. The common causes of education instability that Act 1 targets includes housing instability or insecurity, so students experiencing homelessness, students in the child welfare system, so students in foster care placement, and also students that are involved in the juvenile justice system, so students that are placed in alternative education placements or correctional facilities. And by specifically naming these student populations and the instability that they experience, Act 1 creates a framework, and it creates a framework for providing targeted support and helping to remove barriers that they may have to reaching education goals. Act 1 has been in effect for the last several school years, and of course is in effect for the current school year and beyond. And the purpose of Act 1 centers on 3 objectives. First and foremost, the law aims to ensure on-time graduation for students that have experienced education instability. So too often, these students face barriers to earning credits or meeting graduation requirements simply because of circumstances beyond their control. And Act 1 requires that a graduation plan be developed for eligible students in grades 9 through 12. Secondly, Act 1 works to provide equal access to academic and extracurricular activities, really recognizing that education extends beyond the classroom and that these experiences are crucial for development and also their engagement in school and in their school community. And third, the law explicitly aims to remove systemic barriers for students who have experienced education instability. So this means having schools examine policies and procedures and practices that may inadvertently disadvantage these students and making necessary changes. So around credit assessment and enrollment or registration policies. And then finally, with Act 1 today, we wanted to look at how Act 1 defines identification and eligibility. This is really crucial for understanding which students qualify for these protections under Pennsylvania state law. And of course, it involves the students that we are talking about in this webinar today at that intersection. But we did want to describe the definition a little more clearly. So what constitutes education instability? A student experiences education instability if they have one or more school changes in school entity enrollment during a single school year. And that's really the threshold. Even a single school change can create significant instability in a student's educational experience. And when students change schools, they face challenges like adjusting to new curriculums, making new social connections, catching up on credits, and navigating different school policies and procedures. So it's that school entity change, and also if they are identified in one of the following categories, and you can see those here. So are they experiencing homelessness as defined by the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act? Are they in foster care placement with a dependency adjudication? Third, are they juvenile court involved youth with an adjudication of delinquency? So these are students that have been adjudicated through the juvenile justice system. And fourth, students receiving court-ordered services under voluntary placement or custody agreements. And it's also important to note at the bottom of this slide, we also must consider cross and dual population students. So for example, a student might be both a migrant child and experiencing homelessness, and have experienced a school change. So these overlapping circumstances require us to apply all the relevant protections and supports from each applicable program. The key takeaway is that Act 1 recognizes that education instability has serious consequences. And when that stability is coupled with involvement in homelessness, foster care, or juvenile justice systems, students need additional supports to ensure they can graduate on time and access their full range of educational opportunities. So when examining the intersections among these student populations and the federal programs that provide protections and support, it's also important that we consider Act 1 of 2022. So we wanted to provide that context of a Pennsylvania state law as we further explore next the federal programs that support these student populations.
Thank you so much, Matt. So as Matt said, we're going to dive deep into understanding the 3 federal programs that can support these student groups, these vulnerable youth. Each of the programs, Title I Part D, McKinney-Vento, and Title I Part A foster care provisions, they have distinct purposes, distinct eligibility criteria, and protections. But they also have significant overlaps, right? We've spent the last few minutes talking about that, and they also provide, with those overlaps, they provide opportunities for coordination. So understanding how each of these programs work individually and then collectively is essential for maximizing support for students. So I'm going to say, we're going to do a quick poll to try to understand each person's background, which programs you're most familiar with. So if you could type into the chat which federal program or programs that you're associated with. So are you working with Title I Part D, McKinney-Vento, Title I Part A foster care, or perhaps with other programs that we have not listed here? So this would just help us understand our audience, try to tailor our discussion, and Don't worry if you're not formally associated with any of these programs, that's fine. We welcome everyone who is interested in supporting our youth. So if you could take a minute to type in the chat, and Christine will let us know what we're seeing in the chat.
Lots of expertise in McKinney-Vento. 1 Title I Part D, 1 foster care, 2 foster care, 3. We have a lot of experts in McKinney-Vento here.
All right, amazing, amazing. All right, so hopefully all of our experts in my McKinney-Vento are ready and willing to learn more about Title I Part D and foster care. All right, so I will go to the next slide. All right, so this is a quick overview of the 3 federal programs. During this, you will learn that students can qualify for protections under multiple programs simultaneously. Matt alluded to this, and in fact, many of our most vulnerable youth do. So we're going to explore each program in detail. At any point, we encourage you to ask questions in the chat. Christine will be tracking these for our Q&As, and as I said, we'll be sure to address them at the end of the webinar. Whichever questions we don't get to, we will reach out with responses via email. All right, so we're going to begin with Title I Part D. I'm going to take some time talking about it. So Title I Part D is called the Prevention and Intervention Programs for Children and Youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. And so our program was most recently reauthorized under ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, in 2015 by ESSA. And so the Title I Part D program as a whole has 3 primary goals. The first is to improve educational services for children and youth who are considered to be neglected, delinquent, or at risk, so that they have the opportunities to meet the same challenging state academic content and achievement standards. I'm sure, as you can imagine, sometimes kids who might be in correctional facilities going through education in the correctional system might not necessarily be, the first thought when you think about, educational quality or, them receiving the same type of education standards that kids in their local school districts are getting. So that is one of the goals of this program, is to try to help bridge that gap and try to provide funding for additional educational activities to improve the education services that students in correctional settings get. The second is to provide students with services to successfully transition from institutionalization to further schooling or employment, because we recognize that transition planning is critical for success. So for students who end up in neglected or delinquent facilities, which is what we call the facilities as subgrantees, for students who are in those facilities, we recognize that for them, transition is very important. So we usually say transition begins when they get into the facility. That planning begins when they get into the facility. And during transitions, we're thinking about, when you get out of the facility, even as part of transitions, where we're thinking right from the beginning, what course credits are you coming in with? What do you need to achieve to get to graduation? What do you need if you've dropped out of school? What does GED enrollment look like for you? What are you thinking about career-wise? All of this is to support and to ensure that when the students do end up leaving the facilities, they don't reoffend and end up back in the facility. So that's why transition is a huge part of what we do. Is, as Matt said, again, talking about educational instability. It's one way for us to ensure some type of educational stability for our students. So when they come in with their enrollment records, or they come in with their transcripts or whatever, we can look at it and say, okay, you look like you've done this and this course. This is kind of what we can help you do to ensure that you remain in school and to ensure that when you go back into the community, your credits transfer and you can actually graduate. And then the third is to prevent youth who are at risk from dropping out of school, and to provide students who have dropped out and youths who are returning from correctional facilities with a support system to ensure their continued education. So for a lot of us, something that we usually say with Title I Part D is we know that education is one way to interrupt juvenile justice involvement. And so for a lot of our young people, we want to say, hey, if you're categorized as at risk, we want to provide you services to ensure that you don't end up in facilities, right? We want to interrupt that involvement with the justice system. And if for some reason you have dropped out, we want to provide you enough services so that you can feel comfortable enough to re-enroll back into school if you decide to do that. and also for our young people who are returning from correctional facilities, right? Like I said, transition is a huge part of the program. So for those people who are returning from facilities, not only, so when they leave the facilities, they might not be getting, those services, but we want so that when they get back into their school district, we have that continuation of services, right? So it's not just an abrupt cutoff. So that's the third purpose of the program. So as I said, Title I Part D, we recognize that education is key to breaking cycles of involvement with the juvenile justice system. And that is the whole purpose of this program, is to support youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system or also in the child welfare system. So when I say neglected, delinquent, or at risk, what exactly am I talking about? So when I say neglected youth or youth who are neglected, these are students who are in public or private residential facilities due to abandonment, neglect, or death of their parents or guardians. And these are often, students who are in the child welfare system. And then youth who are delinquent are those who are in residential facilities who have been adjudicated as delinquent or adjudicated to be in need of supervision. These are youth in juvenile justice system. So when we say adjudicated for Title I Part D, we specifically mean a judge or some type of court has made a determination and has sentenced that kid and said, hey, go to this facility or go to this treatment center to serve out your sentence. So for adjudication, a court or a judge must be involved. And then youth who are at risk are school-aged individuals who are at risk of academic failure, dependency or delinquency adjudication, youth who have substance issues, youth who are pregnant or parenting, youth who are 1 or more years behind grade level, English learners, youth who might be involved in gangs, youth who have a history of dropping out of school, or youth who have a high rate of absenteeism. So Title I Part D has quite a broad definition of who we consider to be at risk. So this is these are the parameters for who we consider to be at risk. So anybody, any student who fits into any of those categories defined under at-risk youth, if their local school district has an at-risk program with Title I Part D funds, they can be eligible to participate in that program and receive services. So it's important to understand that based on this definition, a student can receive services under multiple categories. For example, a neglected youth may end up being adjudicated into a correctional facility and then receive Title I Part D services there. As we said, right, a lot of times these youth cut across multiple systems, and so we don't just see, a static, a youth, for 6 years is, categorized as neglected. Something might happen, and then they end up being adjudicated into a delinquent facility. So, as I said, Title I Part D funds may also support youth who are at risk in local schools and youth who and sometimes these youth are at risk for, justice involvement, especially when you consider maybe they're past with child welfare involvement. So that's kind of what we think about when we see youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. Those are the definitions, and they are based off of the statute. The statute is very clear with their definitions about who is eligible for Title I Part D. And in line with these definitions for students who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk, we also have the types of facilities that they stay in, right? So we call them neglected facilities or delinquent facilities. And neglected facilities, think, group homes, residential treatment centers, and then for delinquent facilities, think prisons, jails, detention centers, adult correctional institutions, some residential treatment centers as well, wilderness camps. So it varies. We see different types of facilities that fall under neglected, delinquent, and then the at-risk program is just a program being run at a local school that also receives delinquent funds, so funds to serve youth who are delinquent. All right, so Title I Part D is actually divided into 2 subparts that serve different settings, and this gets a little bit confusing. Subpart 1 provides funding to state agencies that are responsible for providing free public education for children and youth in institutions for neglected or delinquent children and youth, attending community day programs for neglected or delinquent children and youth, or in adult correctional institutions. So this subpart 1 focuses on state-run facilities. So in Pennsylvania, your subpart 1 agencies who receive Title I Part D subpart 1 funds are the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections and the Pennsylvania Department of Education, who provides educational services in juvenile facilities, so in facilities for children and youth under 18. And then Subpart 2 provides funding to local education agencies, so to LEAs with high numbers or percentages of children and youth in locally operated juvenile correctional facilities, including facilities involved in community day programs. Community day programs are like kind of like community schools that, so instead of sending kids, so for example, a kid might not be able to go back to their school district, maybe because they've been expelled because of fighting or for one reason or the other, but they're not adjudicated to a facility. And so a judge can adjudicate and say, hey, you need to attend this particular community day program. So community day programs are kind of like neighborhood schools. They are schools, but they're not like your regular schools, and maybe some alternative schools might fit in. But the important thing is that it has to be a program that is specifically designed for children and youth who are neglected or delinquent. So, as I said, this can get a little bit confusing, but the big takeaway is that Subpart 1 is for state level agencies, and then Subpart 2 is for local educational agencies who have high numbers or percentages of youth who are in correctional settings. And then, as I said, both programs or both subparts serve the same goal of supporting youth who are in neglected or delinquent facilities, or youth who are considered subpart 2, youth who are considered at risk. So Title I Part D, we like to consider it to be quite flexible in the activities that it can support, as long as it's supplemental and it's also reasonable and necessary, which is, this is uniform guidance and the statute, the law. So these are some of the main categories of things that people usually use their Title I Part D funds to cover. So the first is transition services. I talked a little bit about transition services. Transition services is a huge deal in Title I Part D, and transition services are actually required under Subpart 1. Subpart 1 subgrantees are required to dedicate 15 to 30% of their funding to transition services. And then for Subpart 2, transition services are not mandated, but they are recommended. We recommend them. And so these services are usually to help students successfully move from the institution back to their traditional schools or back to employment. A lot of people use their transition services to hire like a transition coordinator or specialist. Some of them use it to, pay for time to like coordinate between the local school districts to set up like records transfer systems so students' records don't get lost. That is, I think, the biggest that's the biggest thing that we see, the biggest challenge with our youth in our facilities, that a lot of times their records get missing, or something like that happens. Their records get missing, they can't find their records, they are missing credits. So some states spend a lot of their transition funds just trying to fix that, try to fix that pipeline of having students get their records in time. And then the second is educational services. Title I Part D provides supplemental educational services to improve the overall educational program. So examples of what subgrantees may use their funds for include computers, technology, tutoring, supplemental instructional material, career and technical education, job placement, and career readiness is a huge part of Title I Part D as well. We also use it for career counseling, credit recovery, other academic supports that go beyond what is available like in a traditional educational program. And then the third is for at-risk programming. So at-risk programming is can only really be offered under Subpart 2 by an LEA who has an eligible delinquent facility within their boundaries. And so eligible LEAs who are receiving Title I Part D funds can decide to utilize a part of their Title I Part D funds to support students in their school systems who are at risk of failing or dropping out, even if the students are not in a facility. So the preventive approach is really critical for keeping youth out of the justice system. So as I said, Title I Part D has a very broad definition of at risk. We talked about it earlier. And so any of those students who fall in that category, depending on how the LEA decides to run the at-risk program, is eligible to receive services under Title I Part D Subpart 2. Now we're going to shift to the McKinney-Vento Act, and Karen from SchoolHouse Connection will describe the definition of homelessness under the federal law. Karen.
Thank you so
Much. There is a lot of McKinney-Vento expertise on our call today, so we are going to go through this kind of quickly. But I want to just make sure to say that for those of you who don't work in McKinney-Vento, you are a really important piece of helping to make sure that our children and youth are identified as experiencing homelessness. So we know that all school districts, all public school districts and public charter school districts are required under the law to have a McKinney-Vento liaison who's responsible to identify and support our students experiencing homelessness. But if that is not you, you are an important piece of that puzzle as well. And so making sure that you know who that liaison is and you know what McKinney-Vento is a really important piece to that collaboration to help support our students who are eligible under McKinney-Vento. So when we talk about McKinney-Vento, I want to just provide you really quickly with a definition of who are we talking about when we think about our students who are experiencing homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Act. The McKinney-Vento Act is a federal law that, again, all public school districts and public charter school districts are required to follow. And so this defines any child or youth who is lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence is experiencing homelessness under this law. So when we think about that, we always use that as sort of our North Star and our guiding point to say, is this situation lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence? So we're really looking at, can that student go to the same place every night and sleep in a safe and sufficient space? And so we provided for you on this slide just a little bit of guidance around what that means, because sometimes we hear questions about really what does that look like with what is fixed housing, what is regular housing, and what is adequate housing. So we just wanted you to have some kind of guidelines that we're looking at when we think about that fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And I want to just say very quickly about this adequacy piece, that we are finding that this is more and more common, that our students are lacking adequate housing. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but I just want to put that on your radar because as your students are maybe experiencing changes in living situations and they're maybe experiencing mobility or they're in a place maybe temporarily, really making sure that that adequacy piece is on your radar as well when we're thinking about identifying our students and supporting our students. So on the next slide, we provided you with this living situations that are eligible under the law. So again, in those situations that are lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So this includes any child or youth who is sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. This is what we most commonly refer to as doubled up. So we know that many of our families experiencing homelessness are doubled up, sometimes tripled up or quadrupled up, that they are in someone else's housing because they have nowhere else to go. And so the majority of our students that we identify nationally and in Pennsylvania as well are in the shared housing situation. Nationally, it's about 77% of our students who are identified under McKinney-Vento, and typically our states mirror that kind of percentage as well. This also includes our students who are staying in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds, and that's due to a lack of alternative adequate accommodation. So they're there because they have nowhere else to go. It also includes our students who are in shelters, emergency shelters, transitional shelters, and kind of moving between those different shelter spaces, as well as our students who are living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, really any of those settings that are not meant to be a place where a student is staying. And substandard housing is mentioned very specifically in this particular area. And so I want to just touch on this really quickly because on the last slide I mentioned that adequacy piece. And so our substandard housing is typically where we see students really lacking that adequate nighttime residence. And when I talk to liaisons across the country, one of the things I hear most often is, how do I know what's substandard? Is that me making a judgment call on what that is? Or how do we really define that? And so we provided you on this slide some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education to really pay attention to when we're thinking about, is our student in a substandard living situation? So we typically think of things like, do they lack utilities? Is there running water? Is there mold or other infestations? Are there dangers that make that space not safe for that student to be? So it's not a judgment call. It's based on what is in the Department of Education guidance. And there may be local housing codes. Many states and cities and communities have their own housing codes that also further define that substandard housing. So I just wanted to call particular attention to that because I think sometimes that gets a little bit overlooked when we're thinking about that definition of our students who are experiencing homelessness. And often our students who are moving between different living situations find themselves in situations where maybe they're in a place where they have a roof over their head, but it's definitely not a place that's safe to be. They may be lacking utilities or running water or heat or have some other kind of danger. So I wanted to just draw your attention to that just as a note as well. On the next slide, I want to just particularly call out our unaccompanied homeless youth. So we typically have been kind of changing our language around unaccompanied youth. The law says unaccompanied youth, but we're really looking at youth on their own. And so when we think about our unaccompanied homeless youth, we're thinking about those youth who meet that definition of experiencing homelessness. So again, those are youth who are lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and who are also not in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. And so particularly our students who, again, move between kind of these different programs, who may be exiting facilities or maybe exiting foster care placements, may find themselves as a youth on their own who is experiencing homelessness. And so it's really important that we're paying particular attention to this population of our students. And I want to clarify that when we talk about our youth on their own or our unaccompanied homeless youth under McKinney-Vento, we are talking about a child or youth that is any age. So what we most often think about is our older youth who may have left home or been kicked out or who are couch surfing and kind of staying between different places, but this can include a child of any age. And so it's really important that we're paying particular attention to some of those other situations that we don't often think about. Is this a youth who is on their own? I always share this story just for the sake of an example, but when I was a liaison, I worked with a student in our 4K program who parent had been unexpectedly incarcerated, and for whatever reason, child welfare did not get involved, and that student was not placed anywhere. And so this little 4-year-old bounced between different family members for an entire school year, and we were able to support him and keep him in school and keep him participating in 4-year-old kindergarten because he was eligible under McKinney-Vento. One just important piece to note when we're thinking about working with our unaccompanied homeless youth is that it's really important that we're building trust with those youth. We may not ever hear kind of the whole story of what led that youth to being on their own, because there may be a lot of fear and hesitation around identification, that youth getting in trouble, getting a parent or guardian in trouble, and just kind of unsure of how much to disclose. And so it's really important that we're thinking about what are those strategies that we can use to really build trust with our youth so that we can serve and support them under McKinney-Vento. And then finally, one piece that I want to just mention here, because this is a question that we get asked very often at SchoolHouse Connection, homelessness in and of itself is not a reason to report an unaccompanied youth to Child Protective Services. So we absolutely always want to follow our mandated reporting requirements, but we don't need to report just because that student is identified as experiencing homelessness. So wanted to just make sure to point that out because we've been hearing a lot of questions, particularly recently, about that. So as you're thinking about who those youth might be and partnering with your liaison and working with your liaison to identify students, just wanted to call out our youth on their own to make sure that we're paying particular attention to that population of students. And then on the next slide, just very briefly want to tell you that once we've identified students and we've looked at their nighttime residence and we've really determined that they're lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, McKinney-Vento does give basic protections to those students once they are identified. And so we won't go through all of these in depth, just looking at the time and wanting to make sure that we have time for questions and more information on our foster care as well. But these are the protections that McKinney-Vento offers to our students. And the overall purpose of these basic protections is to make sure that our students have that stability at school that they may be lacking outside of school. And so if they're highly mobile and they're moving around a lot, they can remain in that school where they're attending in order to continue to have that educational stability and to have that support for academic success. I won't go through all of these in depth, but just know that these are basic requirements under the law. And so I included a link here to our Know Your Rights flyers that give rights under McKinney-Vento if you have questions. We also have these available in 17 languages. So if you have speakers of other languages in your LEAs, please feel free to use those as a resource for identification as well. All right, on the next slide, we're going to talk just a little bit about kind of how do we fund some of these programs? What does that look like? And so really wanted to just draw your attention very particularly to Title I Part A funds. We talked about Title I Part D funds for our students who are neglected and delinquent, identified under neglected and delinquent, but wanted to just make sure to really draw your attention to these Title I Part A funds to provide services and supports to our students. And so we did include for you in these slides a resource that goes more in depth on what is the Title I homeless reservation or the homeless set aside for our students. And so under Title I Part A, any LEA that receives Title I Part A, they are required to set aside funds to specifically support children and youth experiencing homelessness. And so we have a lot more resources on how those funds can be used. I'm happy to answer any questions on that. But we also know that Title I-D has requirements. And so making sure that we know that this reservation covers children in local institutions and if appropriate for children in local institutions for delinquent children and neglected or delinquent children in community day programs. And so wanted to just make sure to draw your attention to that because we know that sometimes we think, how do we fund these things and how do we provide the support that we need and where do the funds come from to do that? And so really looking at your Title I Part A funds is important. And I do want to say that when I talk to liaisons, what I hear most often is, I don't know what our reservation is. I don't know who makes that decision, or I'm not a part of that decision making. And so I really want to encourage you, whether you are a liaison, whether you are a foster care point of contact, or whatever your role is within your LEA, to connect with your business office or your federal programs director and be a part of the conversations to determine how these funds are used and how you can best meet the needs of your students using these funds. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to continue for us.
Yeah, thank you. And so we just briefly wanted to share who are students in foster care for the purposes of this program. So I do live in Title I Part A land, so it's great to hear the information on Title I Part D today. But for students in foster care, we follow the definition of foster care established by the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008, also known more plainly as just the Fostering Connections Act. So foster care means 24-hour substitute care for children placed away from their parents or guardians and for whom the Child Welfare Agency has placement and care responsibility. So this includes placement in foster family homes, with kinship providers, meaning relatives or close family friends, in group homes, emergency shelters, residential facilities, childcare institutions, and pre-adoptive homes. So again, further showing this intersection where we can have students that qualify for different programs. The key element for the definition of foster care is that the Child Welfare Agency has legal responsibility for the child's placement and care. This is different from informal kinship arrangements where relatives are caring for children, but the child welfare system isn't formally involved. And if you're looking for a more comprehensive training on foster care, I will be offering a Part 1 and Part 2 webinar on December 15th and 16th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. It's a Monday and Tuesday. So you can spend 3 hours with me talking about students in foster care later in December. So we wanted to allow time for talking about collaboration strategies. So we're moving into that now, but just wanted to plug that upcoming webinar for foster care.
Thank you so much, Matt. So I see we're at 10:50, so I will go through this quickly so that we can have time for questions. So we're just going to talk about collaboration strategies. We've talked a lot about these 3 programs and students who don't necessarily fit neatly into one category. They are, multi-system involved. So we're going to think about what collaboration looks like at the state and the local level. I am going to skip this poll. All right. So at the state level, coordination across the state is very essential for setting the tone and providing guidance and ensuring consistency across these three programs on how we ensure educational stability for students in these groups. So one way we've seen that is SEAs ensuring that coordinators from Title I Part D, McKinney-Vento and foster care communicate regularly. They work together on policy development. They train together across the three programs, so they provide professional development to liaisons across those three programs, ensuring that they have those connections and relationships. Some states develop joint guidance documents that explain how they intersect. They try to align their data systems, create memorandums of understanding. Pennsylvania is a great example of this in practice. So with the Act 1 of 2022, right, that considers the educational stability for students across all three populations. So we see that when states collaborate at the highest levels, it trickles down to the LEAs, and then collaboration is a lot better. And so you can reference this slide later, and we talk a lot more about it in the brief that we created on intersection that we talked about earlier. And so at the local level, either at your districts or at the intermediate units, collaboration can become even more concrete and immediate. So for here, we see, I know that, a lot of you as the homeless liaisons also might know your foster care liaisons and vice versa. I would also ask that you establish those relationships with your Title I Part D points of contact and coordinators within your school districts and boundaries, especially if your district receives those Title I Part D funds. One of the ways you can collaborate is to meet regularly with your contacts. You can share information about students who qualify for multiple programs. You can coordinate services to avoid duplication while ensuring comprehensive support. You can jointly train. We talked a little bit about that. Develop shared protocols, enrollments, record transfers, and create collaborative relationships with community-based organizations. A lot of the times, that our Title I Part D students who are coming out of facilities, sometimes they end up being discharged into homelessness. We do not want that. So for folks on the call, if you can reach out to the Title I Part D state coordinator. She's actually on the call, Trish, to find out if your district receives those funds. So you can coordinate with the facilities within your boundaries to tell them, hey, when you're transitioning students out, can you just ask them, can you screen for homelessness, right? That's a simple thing that they can do, screening for homelessness, so that they can contact, the homeless liaison and say, hey, the student that is getting discharged doesn't have an adequate residence. Can you help him or her out? So that's just one concrete example that you can do. And then I think another thing is, Karen talked a little bit about the protections that McKinney-Vento has for their students. A lot of those protections, we don't have them for Title I Part D, but we do know that our Title I Part D students would benefit from those protections. So in cases where you have the latitude to do that, to apply some of those protections to students who are returning from juvenile justice settings or neglected facilities, please do. We know that they benefit from those. We don't have them, but as much as you can, extend those protections to our students, we will be very grateful. And I will ask Karen and Matt if there's anything they want to add around collaboration.
I think I'm just repeating what you had just shared. We really, these different programs offer different requirements, or they have different requirements amongst them for the student groups. But as you're able to use what you have developed for maybe one student group and provide any extensions, or consider how it may be referenced for another student that qualifies, that would be my primary recommendation. Again, also recognizing that so many of these students have a lot of overlap over time as well. So that would be my collaboration strategy. And as Karen had also shared, just collaborating with different staff at your local education agency. It's really important that you collaborate with your federal programs coordinator, with your Title I Part D coordinator, if your LEA has that, with your foster care point of contact. You're really the advocates in your organizations and your schools for these student populations. And if you're not talking about these student populations, others in your school entities may not be. So it's really important that you put that spotlight on these student groups so that they get the education rights and protections that they are required to get, but also that they deserve.
Just echo what Matt said about connecting with others and just, to put in a plug for sometimes we can feel really siloed in our work of I'm working with McKinney-Vento or I'm working with foster care or I'm working with our students, our neglected and delinquent students, and we feel really siloed in our work. And so I think this is a really unique opportunity to say, let's get together at the table and hear from each other and share what's going on and share about our programs and talk about the different strategies that we use to reach out to our students and families. And to really have that point of collaboration, to just bring everyone to the table and know that we're all partners in this work to support our students.
Thank you so much, Karen and Matt. And I think this is just a little bit more about what we just discussed. So I will skip it and hit the Q&A in the last 3 minutes. Thank you all so much for listening to us. I will open the floor for questions. Christine, have any questions come through that we can answer in the last 3 minutes?
I think we want to address the Pennsylvania of 2022 question around systems involvement. Does it have to be current or have occurred at any time, Matt?
Right. So for students, and I think I understand the question. So for students that are identified for Act 1 in grades 9 through 12, that graduation plan, if they're identified at any time in that high school period, the protections for Act 1 will stay with that student for the duration of their time in secondary education and in high school. The law is not clear for younger age students, so the provisions would extend for at least while they're experiencing education instability and that current school year. So we do have an FAQ guide that will be coming out for Act 1 of 2022 within the next month or two. We have a webinar scheduled for January on frequently asked questions for Act 1. So stay tuned for that. I'm sure that you've registered for this learning series. You'll be receiving a registration invitation for that one as well. So we'll be sharing some of those more FAQ questions for that soon.
Thank you so much, Matt. All right. So on our last slide, or second to the last slide, we just have the contact information for each of these programs. So if you have a question about Title I Part D, Trish Crow is the Title I Part D state coordinator. She's awesome. I've had the chance to work with her a few times, and I think she's on this call. So if you ever have any question, feel free to reach out to her. You can also reach out to NDTAC. Inbox is there. For McKinney-Vento, feel free to reach out to Matt or Karen at SchoolHouse Connection. And for Title I Part A Foster Care, reach out to Matt. All right, so these are just some additional resources that we have for you on the last slide. I'm told that the recording and the slide deck for this will go out to you also. You can references, click through. These are some great resources. I see we have a minute left. All right, I know there's supposed to be an evaluation, so please feel free to bring it up. But thank you all so much. You all have been a great audience. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly, reach out to NDTAC, reach out to Karen, Matt. Matt has my contact information, so he can send that out, and also reach out to Christine. We're always happy to, chat with you all, and I'm always happy to talk about Title I Part D.
And we know it's a lot of information today, and we're not expecting you to consume it all. We just wanted to make sure that you have slides that you can reference. Our brief also has definitions in the appendix so that you could just print them out with definitions of McKinney-Vento, with foster care Part A, Title I Part D, so you can also have it on reference, and you can contact us at any point. Thank you all.
Yeah. And again, today's webinar might just be a great starting point for you to connect back at your school with the individuals that are responsible for these different student groups. If they are not the same person, a lot of shared roles do exist, but if they're not, today might just be a great starting point for you to reach out and say, hey, let's connect so we can really make sure that these students receive these protections and benefits.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. We'll hang out just for maybe a minute in case anyone does have a last question before we abruptly close out our Zoom room. I've dropped the evaluation link for today's session into the chat. We hope you'll join us December 10th for our next ECHIA webinar series, Purposeful Healing, Addressing and Preventing Vicarious Trauma. And we hope everyone has a beautiful Wednesday. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.